Make sure you subscribe to the Below the Surface podcast by Eclipsium in partnership with CRA. We've had the pleasure of speaking with some amazing guests, including Zeno Koba, Richard Hughes, Vincent Zimmer, and more. We discuss topics related to firmware and supply chain security, uncovering those pesky vulnerabilities that lie, well, below the surface in your environments. You can find all the episodes and subscribe by visiting eclipsium.com/podcast or searching for Below the Surface in your favorite podcast catcher.
Welcome back to Business Security Weekly. Quick announcement here. Stay up to date with us on X, formerly known as Twitter. I'm going to keep calling it Twitter. For the latest show clips and updates, find us at SEC Weekly and stay connected with your cybersecurity community. All right, now for this week's leadership and communications articles. You can check out securityweekly.com/BSW340 if you want to follow along as we go through the news or for links to the articles that we'll be covering. All right, Ben and Jason, let's see. Let's start at the top here, which is effective cybersecurity starts at the top. All right, so yeah, I mean, this is I don't think an unfamiliar discussion here. Communications start with a lot of organizations. I think still probably one of the top reasons I hear about CISOs leaving an organization is when security just is non-existent at those higher levels, right? Like they have to beg for pretty much anything they need. There's nothing coming down from the top. They're just constantly fighting against the tide, against the waves, right?
Yeah, it's culture. It's like the success of a security program is defined by the culture at the company, and that's set at the very highest level, right? The board and the CEO and the rest of the E-staff. And so if the rest of the E-staff don't believe in the efficacy of the security program or the ability to execute, or they think that there are other priorities that take over security, then you're not going to be successful at the end of the day, right? I mean, that's where the CEO needs to have a strong hand, be a believer, and be a participant in the process. And I think when that happens, then you start to see effective change. If that's not the case, CISO is going to have a really hard road to hoe.
Yeah. Yeah, and at the end of the day, it's the CEO and the board's job to lead and evangelize that culture, because the executive team, they're gonna take it from the top. They're gonna take their strategies and all of their goals and their KPIs, and they're gonna align it to what the CEO needs and wants on the daily, right? Because ultimately they're reporting to that CEO, and that's what their career is going to be successful based on how they interact with that CEO. So it has to be from the top. It has to be led and evangelized from the top, because everybody else is going to take the lead from there.
And this is a failure right on down the org, right? I mean, you have to look at how you incentivize people, and people will take the way you incentivize them, and then they'll create action plans based upon that. And so if you're telling people that the most important thing is profit, they're going to do anything for profit, right? We've seen that with companies like Boeing, right? And if you tell them that security is not important, you'll see a lot of security deficiencies in an organization. But if you start to take and put as part of your MBOs or your KPIs, if you start to put in their security objectives and making sure things are secure in balance with everything else, then you'll start to see a change, right? Unintended consequences of bad KPIs and MBOs.
Absolutely. And there is no CISO who wants to have their hands tied when it comes to being able to influence the organization to make change, or get, colleagues or even folks that may be at a higher level of leadership to listen and actually action things, right? Nobody wants to be ignored when they come to the table with what, the changes that they want to put in place. So that's why you're seeing so many CISOs, who go into an organization thinking they're going to be able to make effective change, say, my brand isn't worth it. Tarnishing my brand, it's not worth it. And if I'm not going to get the support and I'm not going to get, the buy-in from the rest of the C-suite, I'm not going to move forward. I'm going to go find somewhere else to go.
Yeah, and more we're seeing that pressure from the outside, right? For that to come from the top.
That's right.
Yep. All right, and so this dovetails in nicely with the previous article, as Matt is tends to do when he preps these stories. Mm-hmm. What is a chief information security officer? It was kind of entertaining to go through this, because clearly written from like an external point of view. But I think it's good to revisit this every now and then because it changes over the years, right?
Yeah. No, I mean it is, but there were some aspects of this article that I had some issue with, right? I mean,
Yeah.
just the definition. They had a section that was called, CISO versus the CIO, and it goes
Yeah.
in saying, the chief information officer has a
We got
broader
more of
range
that
of
later.
responsibilities than the CISO. I will argue that all day long that is not the case, right?
Mhm.
While the CIO takes responsibility for all of the organization's technology and information and systems integration and things of that nature, today's CISO is playing more and more in the arena of not just cybersecurity, but business continuity, disaster recovery, compliance, risk, legal, you name it. I mean, we're seeing a day where CISOs are getting put into the CIO position because they have so much deeper and wider responsibility across the organization. So, I would argue that point that it's equal, if not in some cases, in some organizations, more responsibility.
Yeah,
Well,
we've talked about this before, Jason. I think like the
Mhm.
whole CISO title, like Chief Information Security Officer, it's a legacy of being under the CIO, and I think that needs to shift, right? Because it's a different level of responsibility that today's CISO has or CSO, and they're cross-functional across the entire org. I'd argue that outside of maybe HR and the CEO, they touch the entire organization in some form or fashion, right? Where many of the other C-level executives are focused on their function. They get involved, but not to the level that the CISO does.
Right. Agreed
well,
100%.
let's
So,
because it's so closely aligned, let's skip to number 5. Let's go a little bit out of order here. I know that's not usually the way you do things, but I didn't realize how closely aligned. So you latched onto that CISO versus CIO there. So let's talk about the death of the CIO. This is an opinion piece put together by Andy Ellis, who never challenges or trolls folks with this stuff. So,
right.
what did you make of this article? The shadow IT stuff kind of threw me off a bit. Like I
Yeah,
definitely
it did. I mean, I read through the article again. There were some aspects of it that I wasn't 100% on board with from a historical representation on why the CISO exists. But at the end of the day, I took a step back and I tried to consume this for the larger article and really what they were trying to put out there. And for me, I think it supports the fact that while a CISO was brought up and I can agree with this, a CISO was brought up in the blind spots of the CIO. In many instances, I think the CISO is beginning to exceed the CIO as far as their responsibility, their ability to be strategic within the organization, and I could agree that maybe the shelf life of the CIO maybe in the same arena as the shelf life of the CISO, right? Does it need modernization? Is it a security focused leader that needs to be in that position? So, I can argue for that, kind of that final umbrella statement that he's trying to make throughout, and trying to take some of that historical representation and put that aside. I can agree with Andy on, I think the CISOs are positioned to kind of take that leadership role. I think the new CIO should be security centric and be that security, regulatory, compliance, risk management leader.
Yeah, I actually I agree a lot with this article. I've been talking about this for a long time. And about 2 years ago, I took a CISO role where they actually asked me to take over IT, right? And so I was the
Mhm.
CIO and had privacy under me as well. And so I'm familiar with this. And like driving into it, I had a lot of concerns. A lot of people tell me, oh, this is going to be difficult. Yeah, I mean, it's the same stuff we deal with as CISOs on a normal basis, running applications, deploying technologies, right? But we're thinking about it from a security first side. And so it went fairly well for me. I think, I've talked to other organizations that are also looking to do this. And I think one of the biggest things is we look at transformation and we look at more companies moving, fully digital, fully cloud-based, SaaS-based applications. What does the CIO do, right? There's less legacy infrastructure. There's less to do, especially as you look at the startup world and emerging technology companies. Like I know of several companies that are investing in CISOs before they're investing in CIOs because much of that stuff that the CIO used to do has now moved either to the chief technology officer or the chief product officer. And so it leaves that corporate IT estate in things like O365, which look, there's a lot of security concerns around it, and it can easily fall under the CISO to run that. So again, in the last article, I talked about maybe the chief information security officer doesn't make sense. Maybe the title does. It's really hard to figure out where we're going to end up. But I do agree with much of what Andy's saying in this article. Like definitely think that there's a lot of lead in.
100%. I completely agree with the strategy here, right? I was in the same boat, Ben, right? So started off as a CISO within a $500 million organization that had 6,000 customers and supported 35 of the Fortune 100, right? And the CEO came to me one day and said, I want to make you the CIO. And the challenge I put in front of the CEO was, I will never eliminate the security portion of my role. I will never have a conflict with the security portion of my role. Therefore, if I'm to become CIO of this organization, I need to be the CISO as well. That was, I threw the gauntlet down. I will not remove the security aspect of my role. Non-negotiable.
I don't think I'm certainly not advocating for that. When I look at it, I think about a CISO who's doing the CIO role. I think it makes more sense because the challenge that we've often faced as CISOs is we talk about it all the time is a conflict of interest, right? There's a conflict of interest with the CIO because he's trying to do things on an availability basis, and as a result, security kind of gets in the way of that sometimes. And last article, we talked about MBOs and KPIs and things that you can do to fix some of that. But at the end of the day, if you flip the script on that and the CISO takes that lead role and has a VP of IT that's reporting to him, and you're doing everything from a security onset, but you also have the desire to deliver availability, resiliency, all those things, I don't think the conflict is really there, right? Like it's actually a marriage made in the best interest of the company as opposed in the best interest of trying to keep things up.
100% agreed.
Yeah, and it's interesting you say that. I think it's a clue if you read the very last line or part of the line of this article. Andy says, "How long will a CIO who doesn't take on security oversight last?" So he makes that qualification there, and I think sometimes Andy's articles, like the most contextually important thing is sometimes at the very end there. So you kind of have to read the article in its entirety. And once I got to that point, I was like, aha, okay, now let me reread the article.
Exactly.
Having read
I'd even in that last line, the last bastion of the CIO may be laptop management. Really? How many CIOs really own that? Like that ends up falling into the CISO a lot of times. So I think that's already gone. Like that ship has sailed.
Yeah, it's also interesting you mentioned the availability side of this. I just wrote 2.5 hours of training workshop for vulnerability management. For making it more efficient. And one of the things that I look at, when I look at more legacy, older structured companies doing vulnerability management, newer ones, is that the newer companies, it's not availability focused, and that's where you tend to see these kind of nightmare vulnerability management cases where, critical patches, it's taking months to get them applied. It's very much a culture of, when we're 110% certain that this patch is not going to take something down, then we'll apply it, versus an organization that says, you know what? We've got resilience in place. It's okay if stuff goes down. There's a number of ways that things could go down. A patch is just one of them. We're going to automate patching as much as possible and update that software pretty much the moment it comes out. And we'll have a good plan for, if something, bad does happen to availability.
But Adrian, I saw that all the time, right? One of the things I always used to laugh at was that in and of itself is a vulnerability. Like you're saying that deploying the patch is going to bring the system down. Like that's crazy. Like you've got to have a better way to have resilience than say that managing your systems is in and of itself a vulnerability to your operation. Like
100% of business.
How do you qualify resilience?
Yep.
Yeah, and I regularly advise companies that still run the way they run is no one patches anything unless the security team makes them. Like that's the way the organization runs, and that's just normal for them. And it blows my mind.
It does. It really does.
So let's move back to number 3 here. So CISOs struggling to balance regulation and security demands with rising cybersecurity pressures.
I think we talked a lot about that in the last segment. I mean, we went through that. The pressures are on for the CISOs, right? And ultimately, I mean, all the way down to personal lawsuits. So between the regulatory environment, the legal environment, international law, we're seeing that international legislation. The pressure is on.
Yeah,
so
Jason,
what's this talks about a burnout, right?
Well, I think it contributes greatly to the potential for burnout, right? I'm not a fan of regulation. Like I've articulated that many times. Like I don't think regulation is the way to go, but we're kind of forced down that path because nobody's doing the right thing. But the challenge there, and when we had the earlier session when we were talking to Igor, I wanted to call a little bit of devil's advocate to the fact that compliance and security really should be the same thing. Like I don't think they are in the vein that compliance is always behind where security needs to be, right? Just the nature of it, like the nature of passing regulations, laws, rules. I go back to a time earlier in my career when I talked to the CISO and he said, look, are we getting any value of this FIM product? And I said, yeah, we're not really getting any value at all, but it's mandated by PCI, right? Now that we could have done FIM differently and potentially gained value from it, but being forced into do something because of a regulation versus it actually making sense for the organization and the risk tolerance and the level of security you're putting on, that's a conflict and a problem. Like we go down this path of regulation far too easily and get stuck doing things that don't make any business sense. And I've seen that a lot lately with things that have moved to the cloud, and regulation just doesn't take that into account. Mm-hmm. Show me your backups. Like there isn't a backup. It's the cloud. Like
the problem then is that they're coming at it with a stick because there aren't really carrots and we're not moving, right? So with lack of regulation, we're making zero movement. That's the struggle, right? Because where is the carrot to want to move forward?
Yeah, agreed. Like again, not a fan of regulation, but I don't see another way past it. But I think it just digs us deeper into a hole.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so this next one, number 4, really kind of goes deeper down that rabbit hole of the what's pushing us to do this, and regulation getting to the point where okay, now we need to you're going to get a whole group of people together and determine materiality. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So it's been really interesting hearing a lot of CISOs talk about, all the different ins and outs of this and the most insane portion of it, which is malicious adversaries using the SEC rules against companies.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's one of their tactics. But, I think at a foundational level and Ben, if you agree with this, but, we need a definition. And that definition for our organization needs to be a shared conversation between the cybersecurity leader, the compliance leader, legal, the finance, the board of directors. I mean, we really need to go through that process of having multiple perspectives in that conversation to build out that definition. There's no real other way that I can see how we're going to be able to define materiality for our organization.
And it has to survive public scrutiny, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, in a public company, that's the challenge, right? Is what's material. And I think even the bigger challenge is this was materiality, and the regulations around it were generally written at a somewhat, I would argue, maybe a simpler time. I don't know if that's necessarily the case when you get into finances, but they were written against, I guess, a much more understandable quotient of things happening, right? Still complex, but when you look at the realm of cyber, determining whether it's material or not, a lot of that just comes into opinion. Like the average investor knows little to nothing about cybersecurity. And so how are you supposed to make that judgment? And we've talked about this before in other episodes as well. Weighing in that something's material when it's really not material can have additional repercussions, right? It's the unintended consequences problem. So somebody decides to make a trade and it really had nothing to do with it, and it still affects them in a negative way. Like that's not the intent here, but that's what we're headed down. And so I do think there needs to be some guidance about what should be defined as material and when it broaches that threshold.
And there's the timing issue, Ben, right? We've talked about this where, the fact today, as you start to uncover things, may not be the fact 3 days from now.
Yeah.
Right. So where does that liability stand? If I make a statement today based on the facts that I know now, but in 3 days we have more reliable information or better information to work with or more telemetry to work with, and we come up with a different response now, where's that liability from that first statement? Are we held to
Yeah.
that?
I think one of the issues here is by not making companies more transparent about their failures, we don't have a whole lot of precedents to go on here. So, SEC's like, what do you think is material? Companies are like, I don't know. What do you think is material? And the way this is going to play out is just precedents, is companies trying to take a stab at it. And then the SEC is going to come back and either say, yeah, you got it right, or no, you got it wrong. And we're just going to learn in real time, right?
Yeah. I mean,
the challenge
I was just going to say, Ben, unfortunately for the companies who get hit, they're going to be the test cases, right?
Yep.
It's going to play out in the court of law.
Well, before it plays out in the court of law, it's going to play out in the executive staff and the boardroom, right? And that's my concern is, so, you're the CISO of a publicly traded company. You have an issue that happened and you have full confidence that this is a material incident, right? And the CFO says, yeah, no, I don't think it is.
Yep.
Right. And so then it's just that insurer power struggle. And like, what do you need to document? What do you need
but I think that butting heads is going to play out in the court of law eventually.
Well, yeah.
That's right. Here as a CISO. Like, I don't want to be on the defendant side of that, court of law problem.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Oof. Yeah. And, I don't know. Maybe it's a good place to wrap, and we can leave the next two later, because I feel like that's a really important conversation. Because all that's coming up. We haven't seen that yet, and actually the FTC and the SEC have some great postmortem write-ups that I feel like don't get publicized enough, and I try and drill into those and share those when I find them. Like that bank that, I had no idea that bank went under, because of, failure to do compliance and hold the CISO, the CISO to be compliant. He doesn't get to be exempt. There's a reason these rules are in place.
I mean, the only advice I would say right now is, and again, legal may butt heads with you on this, is try to be as transparent as you possibly can. And don't make misleading statements or communications at all. Part of what, the thread they're pulling on for SolarWinds is, misleading information being sent to clients on the status of the breach, and that's the thread they're pulling on. So it's scary. So
if we're going to end on this, I got one last question for you both. How much do you have to document that and share that, right? Like, if it's not material, you don't have to file an 8K, right? But if you determine it's not material and it ends up being an issue, you want to have some kind of documentation somewhere where you can say, here's the conversation we had, and here's how we came to this conclusion that it was not material.
There's a term that's not used very much anymore. It's called an internal memo. That's going to start being used a lot more.
Right.
There's going to be a lot of internal memos being sent, like even, sending an email to yourself. Hey, I disagreed with what the CFO said. My position on it is very clear, and documenting it in a system so it's there. So if it blows back on you, you can come back to that and say, look, I weighed in on this. It just wasn't, my opinion wasn't taken. But again, you've got to be very clear what you put in documentation, what you don't put in documentation. You got to be transparent. It's got to be truthful. I will guarantee you that other people are going to be sending internal memos to either other members of the staff or to themselves. So you better start doing the same. And look for representation by external counsel and advice. I think that's going to be something else we're going to see.
Right. I was going to say the same thing. Once the stuff hits the fan, all of that information will be discoverable. So be intelligent with what you're documenting, right? And be proactive with what you're documenting, and make sure you don't take anything for granted. But again, transparent, always telling the truth. And if there are issues or disagreements within the C-suite, internal memo. I agree with you, Ben.
I look forward to DocuSign's new product, Internal Memo CYA.
Yeah.
All right. And with that, thanks so much, Jason and Ben. It's been a pleasure getting to guest host today's episode. Thanks so much for all your input and everything.
Yeah, great having you on, Adrian.
Yeah, good time. Thanks, Henry.
And a big thanks to everyone for watching or listening to this week's episode of Business Security Weekly.